Hey everybody, and welcome back to my coverage of the PogChamps 3 tournament. This video we're going to be looking at the Group B match, world famous poker player Daniel Negreanu versus Spanish variety streamer Rubius. Now, Daniel won his first matchup versus Pokimane. Rubius lost his matchup, so Daniel Negreanu also has the higher rating, so Daniel is the clear favorite in this matchup, but Rubius could pull an upset. So without further ado, let's just get right into the chess. Rubius has the white pieces for the first game, and this is an exciting game, let me tell you. We have e4 and c5 by Daniel, so going for a Sicilian defense. And Rubius here plays an interesting move, which is c3, so he's going for the Alapin Sicilian, or the c3 Sicilian, as it's sometimes called. And I think this is a very good choice for Rubius, because it sort of avoids all of the opening theory that you need to learn in order to play the open Sicilian effectively. So if you don't want to learn that theory, or if you don't have time to learn that theory, the c3 Sicilian is a good alternative, sort of anti-Sicilian. We have d6 and d4, c cross d4, c cross d4, and now Rubius has a great center, so this is looking like a very strong start for him. We have knight f6, bishop d3, a6, knight f3, so both players just continue development, and we have b5. So it looks like Daniel is sort of going for a Najdorf-like setup, because these moves, knight f6, a6, b5, and d6, they're all played in the Najdorf Sicilian. So it looks like somebody maybe introduced him to the Najdorf, and now he's going for this setup with these sequence of moves. However, this is not actually a Najdorf, because it's an Alapin Sicilian. So the pawn structure for white is very different, and this setup from black isn't going to be as effective as we may see. Anyway, the game continued. Rubius castled. We have bishop b7 from Negreanu. Once again, this is a very common move to be played in the Sicilian, as well as Negreanu's next move, knight bd7, also a very common move in the Najdorf. We have bishop g5 and h6, bishop h4, rook c8, Daniel getting his rook to that open file. Very good, and Rubius develops his last minor piece with knight c3. And here, Negreanu makes sort of a big mistake. He plays e5, and this is just not very good at all. e6 would have been much better, just looking to develop this bishop just so you can get castled. Really, you just want to get this bishop out of the way so that you can castle. You don't really want to be inviting these center trades that will open up the center when it still is going to take at least 2 more moves for you to castle. So not the best move from Negreanu, but we'll see if Rubius can punish him for it. We have knight d5, so now that this pawn can no longer advance to e6, Rubius hops in with his knight on this square, and also pressures this pinned knight, which is very good. So this is a good move by Rubius. And here Negreanu sees that he can win a pawn, or he thinks he can win a pawn. It doesn't actually work out, as we're going to see later, but he thinks here he can play the move g5. And his idea is, I'm going to unpin my knight from my queen and gain a tempo on your bishop, and after bishop g3, now I have 2 attackers on your knight, and I'm going to be able to win this pawn since you only have 1 defender. So this is what Daniel goes for. He goes knight takes d5, and after e takes d5, bishop takes d5. But what Negreanu missed is that once this pawn recaptures on d5, there are a lot of attackers on this e5 pawn. Both the rook is unleashed, and also when this bishop came to g3, it was attacking this pawn once more. And with this kingside pawn advance and also the center pawn advance, black's king is going to have a really hard time finding safety, and the center is opening up. So this is not good news for Negreanu. So everybody was expecting Rubius to open up this center because he's got enough attackers on this e5 pawn, but Rubius surprises everyone with knight d2. I'm not sure exactly what Rubius was thinking with this move, but d cross e5 would have been much better. And here, Negreanu actually has to give up a few more pawns just to get his king safe. So an example line could go bishop e6, and this gives up the d6 pawn, but you have to block this file from any discoveries, so you have to play bishop e6. So after e cross d6, now you still need to develop your dark squared bishop to castle, so we have bishop g7, and after bishop f5, taking advantage of this pinned bishop, you don't really have time to defend this bishop again. You just have to get castled, and this loses a 3rd pawn after bishop cross e6 and f cross e6 and rook cross e6. So Rubius could have gone for this, but instead he plays knight d2. This allows Negreanu to get his last bishop developed and castle very safely. So huge blunder from Rubius here, but you know, that's just how things go. We have bishop g7, and Rubius now admits his mistake when he moves his knight back to f3. So really just admitting this mistake and agreeing that this knight is better on f3. And now this allows Negreanu to castle. So Rubius basically gave Negreanu 2 free moves. And now, yeah, castling is definitely the best move here. Even though you're going to lose this pawn, it's well worth it to get your king safe. It's well worth giving up that pawn. And also you're a pawn up anyway, so it's not like you're going to be a pawn down. We're going to be back to even material. So we have d cross e5, d cross e5, and here you have to take the pawn with the knight. And the reason is we're actually going to see in the game. But after knight takes e5, knight takes, bishop takes, and rook takes e5, this would be a fairly even game. White would probably be a little bit better because of black's sort of exposed king, but this would be a fairly even game. However, Rubius does not take the pawn with the knight. Instead, he takes with the bishop, which is definitely not a good move. Normally, you want to... what I was going to say is normally it's better to, if you can take free pawns like this, but you have to trade a minor piece, normally it's better to take with the knight first rather than the bishop. If you end up not losing the bishop anyway, you end up actually losing the bishop anyway, so I don't know what I was thinking. But it just seems more natural for many strong players to take with the knight first rather than the bishop. More natural anyway. But here it's bad for a completely different reason, and that is because now there's this remove the defender tactic that Negreanu can play, which is bishop takes f3, and this is attacking the queen, so you have to take this bishop. So after queen takes f3, this is actually not even the best move either. You have to actually take with the pawn and expose your king here, because if you take with the queen, for example, then we have knight takes e5, and this is a fork on the queen and the bishop. So here you have to actually sack your rook for this knight, because it's also a discovered attack on the bishop. So even if you move your queen to a spot that still defends the bishop, you're still going to lose that bishop. So you have to sack your rook, and here black is just going to be up a whole rook. So completely winning position for black. So here Rubius would have had to take with the pawn, and after knight takes e5, bishop e4, for example, because you have to defend this f3 square, and just queen takes d1 and rook a takes d1. Black will be up a piece, and white has this shattered kingside pawn structure. So still a very winning position for black. So Negreanu did have that tactic available to him with bishop cross f3. However, he did not play this. Instead, I think he was focused on not losing this bishop, and he played f6 instead. And this is a definitely a missed win from Negreanu. We have bishop d4 and rook to e8. So Negreanu just looking to trade pieces. We have rook e3, rook takes e3, and f takes e3. Probably better would have been bishop takes e3. And you may think that Negreanu has the same bishop takes f3 tactic, where if the queen takes, now there's knight e5, forking the bishop and the queen, so you have to take with the pawn here. However, you actually can take with the queen, because after knight e5, we have queen f5, and now after knight takes d3, we have rook d1, pinning this knight to the queen, so the knight will be won back. There's nothing black can do here. So after queen c7, for example, and queen takes d3, this would be a pretty even endgame. Once again, white would probably be a little bit better because of black's exposed king, but still fairly even overall, and even on material as well. So yeah, bishop takes e3 would have probably been a little better positionally, because the move Rubius played, f takes e3, is just very positionally weakening to white's king here. We have knight c5, e4, and bishop f7, so just a little maneuvering of the pieces. However, this pawn was actually free. Negreanu could have taken it because he has 2 guys on this pawn, and white only has 1 defender. So this is kind of what I was saying earlier. Here, you would probably want to take this with the knight first, and that way you're not losing your knight, you still maintain your bishop pair. This is kind of what I was mentioning earlier. But, I mean, either piece still works because you're still winning a pawn. But we have bishop f7, queen e2, and here Negreanu had another tactic he could have played, which is g4, and this is basically kicking the knight away from this defense of the bishop. So you're attacking the knight. If the knight moves, you lose the bishop. So knight e1, for example, we have queen takes d4 check, and black just wins a piece. So if you try to make things complicated with, say, bishop takes c5, now we have g takes f3, and this is an attack on the queen. So you may think you can play queen e3, defending your bishop, but now we have rook takes c5, and the queen is overworked. So after queen takes c5 and queen takes d3, g takes f3 and queen takes f3, we have this two bishops versus rook imbalance, and both of the kings are not very safe. Though this is probably better for black, especially if black can get the queens traded off. So Negreanu could have gone for this g4 tactic, but instead he plays knight takes d3, simply taking the bishop, getting rid of Rubius's bishop pair. We have queen takes d3 and rook c6. We have queen e3, queen c8, and we have e5. Negreanu plays rook e6, and we have h4. And this h4 move, we think Rubius was inspired by some world champions and very high-level chess, where this h4 move has become very common in the past few years. Just very aggressive and hyper-modern, pushing the king side. It's not actually very effective here, but I admire his creativity, his idea to do this h4 move. But here it really just weakens the king. It's not really the best try in this certain position, but like I said, good job for him. We have f takes e5, and not moving this bishop from Rubius. Instead, we have rook c1, a counter attack on the queen, and we have queen d8. So this bishop cannot be captured, obviously, because while it is attacking the queen twice, Rubius has this rook takes c8 move, and it's check. So after king h7 and queen f2, this would be totally winning for white. So you cannot take the bishop, which is why Negreanu played queen d8, so good on him for not taking the bishop. And now Rubius saves his bishop with bishop b6. However, it doesn't actually save the bishop. He needed to play a move like bishop c3, because here there's just two attackers on this bishop. So I think Rubius thought he was gaining a tempo on this queen, but there are two attackers and there's only one defender. Rubius probably missed this lateral rook defense. And Negreanu also probably missed this because he played queen b8, not taking the bishop. So I think he probably just missed that this rook was attacking. And Rubius continues with his plan. The reason why he played h4, he played h takes g5 next, so he did not notice that his bishop was hanging. And now this is when Negreanu actually noticed that this bishop was hanging, and he took it with queen takes b6. So yes, now Negreanu is up a piece, and this is looking to be very good for Negreanu. Here, Rubius thought Negreanu had blundered his queen and played queen takes b6. However, this is not actually good for him because now he's down in material after rook takes b6, and you never really want to be trading when you're down in material. The game continues. Knight takes e5, and this is another blunder from Rubius. So this is simply a hanging knight. Negreanu should definitely take this knight, and we were sort of expecting him to take this, especially since this hanging knight seemed a little more obvious than this hanging bishop a couple moves earlier. However, Negreanu also misses this knight, and instead he plays h takes g5, just recapturing this pawn, which was captured a few moves earlier. However, this is a blunder because now Rubius has the move rook c8 check, and Rubius is actually going to win his piece back here because if bishop f8, then we have knight d7, a fork on the rook and the bishop. So if we have rook d6, for example, knight takes f8 and king g7, this knight might get trapped, but at least Rubius has won his piece back. It's definitely going to be hard for black to win this knight back. So it gets complicated, but Rubius could have at least won his piece back like that. However, Negreanu does not make him go for this knight d7 move. He simply plays king h7. I'm not sure if he saw this bishop f8 block or not, but anyway, Negreanu plays king h7, simply hanging the bishop, and Rubius takes it with knight takes f7. So now we've got a fairly even endgame. Black is probably a little better because he's got the bishop and there are pawns on both sides of the board. Arguably a little more active king, maybe. Anyway, we have bishop d4 check, and it's important you don't move to f1 here because of this rook f6 check is a fork on the king and the knight. Rubius sees this and he plays king h2 instead. We have king g6 attacking the knight, and the knight is actually kind of low on squares here. Probably knight d8 was best, but Rubius instead goes for knight h8 check, and this allows king f5. So Negreanu just activating his king, and then in the endgame, king g8 was definitely a better move, trapping the knight. So the rook now has to stay connected to the knight, and rook h6 is coming next. It doesn't actually matter what white plays here. King g3, for example, and still rook h6, and this knight is going to be lost. So this is how Negreanu could have won a piece here. However, Negreanu goes for king f5 instead. We have rook f8 check, rook f6, and now you definitely can't take this rook because simply king takes, and the knight is once again trapped. There's going to be king g7 next, and the knight will be lost. So a move you could try is rook f7, and now if Negreanu trades here, then this is a good try for white. Black will still win this pawn and has the bishop, so this is still a winning endgame for black, but it's at least a better try for white, because if you go for anything else, then Rubius played rook d8 here, and Negreanu played bishop takes b2. You're simply losing this pawn. This knight is going to be lost soon too with a move like rook h6 could be coming soon. The rook is just stuck on the back rank. This is not going to be good for white at all. Rubius goes for rook d5 check. We have king f4, g3 check, king e4, rook d7, and now Negreanu has escaped the checks. He goes for this rook h6 check finally. So Rubius tried to defend this f7 square to let his knight escape, but it's one move too late. We have rook h6 check, and after king g2, and rook takes h8. Negreanu is up a piece. This is going to be a winning endgame for Negreanu, so let's see how he converts this. Or if he blunders and Rubius gets back in the game. We have rook d2 and bishop e5. We have rook e2 check and king d5. We have g4 and a5. So Negreanu now just wants to make a passed pawn on the queen side and promote one of those pawns. But here actually Negreanu could have played rook h2 check, and this would have just simplified things, simply trading this rook. And now you're up a piece. You have this queenside pawn majority, and so this would have been the simplest win. However, a5 is also winning, so that's fine. We have king f3 and rook h3 check, king g2. Once again, you could have gone for this rook h2 check, but Negreanu plays rook g3. We have king f2 and rook takes g4, so just picking up that g4 pawn. Now we have king f3 and rook a4. We have king f2 and rook b4. So Negreanu, first he was going after this a pawn, but realized it was going to be hard to pick up because the rook defends. So now instead he goes for this rook b2 idea, which would be a pin. He could either trade rooks or just pick up the a pawn. So this is what he goes for. We have king f3 and rook b2. So you're either going to have to trade rooks here as Rubius, or you're losing the a pawn. Rubius decides to play rook e4, and here Negreanu, once again, really the cleanest win would have just been rook f2 check, and this is deflecting the king away from the defense of the rook. So you just trade rooks and you're up a bishop. You have this passed pawn and a pawn majority here, so it's just a very easy win. And even if the king moves to e3, then there's simply rook e2, and now the king has to capture the rook, because if you don't capture the rook, then you're just losing your rook outright. So once again, this would have been the cleanest win, but Negreanu simply takes the a2 pawn, which is totally fine too. And here Rubius, probably in a bit of time trouble, plays king g4, or maybe he's just hoping for a stalemate. Obviously, Negreanu can now simply capture this rook, but the move he plays is winning 2, which is rook a4. And after king takes g5, rook takes e4, king f5, and a4, Rubius resigned here. So the first game goes to Negreanu. I don't think I have anything else to say about this game, but we'll see if Rubius can bring it back in the second game and take this match to an Armageddon. So thank you for watching, and be sure to check out my PogChamps 3 plays. It's up there. Check out the next game of the match. It's going to be on that side of the screen. And thank you for watching. I love you all, and I'll see you next time.